do? Why do we behave in this way? And so these theories seek to answer those questions. And then they also seek to predict the social world. Okay, how can we predict what will happen in the future? Given a certain scenario, how can we predict how humans will react? Can we predict how will they interact with one another? Okay? So the first theory the first perspective that we're going to talk about is this perspective called functionalism. Okay, and what functionalism says, or what functionalism believes, is that society is made up of interrelated parts, so parts that are working together. Think about like in a car. Okay, you have all these parts like the engine, the muffler, the steering wheel. They're all different, they're all separate from one another, but they all work together to make the car run. Okay, so society is made up of these interrelated parts that work together to make a whole unit. Okay, and functionalism comes out of the teachings or the ideas of Auguste Comte, Spencer, and then Emile Durkheim. Okay, so these are three individuals who are very much proponents of functionalism that help to develop the perspective. And we'll remember with Spencer, he viewed society as an organism. Okay, he came out, this was right when the theory of evolution is first becoming big. People are starting to understand the human body. And so they make the analysis or the analogy between the human body and society, saying that it's all interrelated parts and that society is an organism. Okay, and it takes these interrelated parts, these different components, to make the organism healthy. Right? If we think about the human body, we have like the heart and the lungs and the stomach. They're all different, but they all work together for our own health. Right? They create the whole. We being the whole, those interrelated parts help to create us. And then to understand society, they say that you have to study the structure and the function. So the structure would be how the parts relate to one another, how all the pieces fit. Think of it like a puzzle, how these pieces fit together, how they interact with one another. Is there a hierarchy? Do they interact with one another with a lot of like contempt? Do they interact with another in harmony? Do they interact with another as equals? Things of that nature. And then the function would be more, what is the purpose of this structure? So if we think like a police force, right? A police force is a structure. They interact. How do they interact with society? They interact with the government on some level. They interact with the people on some level. But their function is to preserve the peace. It's to create a safe environment. Their function is to help protect us. Okay? And then out of these functions, they usually define them in two different ways. There can be manifest functions, which are the functions that create something that you intend. So I guess to illustrate this, recently the state of Illinois just raised the age of tobacco consumption, right? It went from 18 to 21. And the manifest function of that was to lower teen smoking rates, right? They didn't want teens to have access to the tobacco. They wanted to lower the smoking rate. So they said, let's go ahead and bump the age requirement up. So that would be the manifest function, right? Lowering teen smoking rates. But there's also a latent function, something that they didn't intend. And what that would be like, now there's a black market for tobacco, right? You have this population of 18, 19, and 20-year-olds that used to have access to tobacco. They used to be able to go out and buy it, but now they no longer can. So what that has done is created a black market where these people are going to find alternative routes to accessing that tobacco, right? That black market for tobacco that has now been established is a latent function. We didn't want to create that, but it was created out of the function. It is an unintended consequence. And then functions can also be dysfunctional, right? Do you remember with Comte, he had this theory of social statics and social dynamics. Social statics being the forces that keep society together, social dynamics being the forces that cause change. And you can see a dysfunction would be something that disrupts society, or would be kind of along the lines of those social dynamics, things that can change society, things that can cause the organism, the human body, if we're using that analogy, to not function as properly or as efficiently as it once did. And then also, this is a macro theory. Okay, do we know the difference between macro and micro? Right? Macro is big, it's large scale. So a functionalist is concerned with how society functions as a whole. You're looking at large groups of people, large institutions, and how they engage with one another. Whereas a micro, there will only be, of the three theories, two of them are going to be macro, one of them is going to be micro. Micro is more concerned with how humans interact individually, how we engage with one another on an individual level, but we'll get into that in just a moment. So to help kind of illustrate this theory, because it can kind of be hard to imagine, it is a little bit abstract, the analogy that the book gives, they use a lot of sports analogies, so we're going to use a football team. Okay, so if we imagine a football team, there's 11 different positions on the field, and each one of those positions has a different role, a different job to do. And even the makeup of the players can be somewhat different, the structure can be different, right? Like a wide receiver or a defensive back, they don't look like an offensive or a defensive lineman. They have a different structure, but they also have a different function. And that function is tied to the structure, right? If you have a wide receiver who's really, really fast, his function is to run down the field and catch the ball. Where a defensive or offensive lineman, if their structure is they're big and strong, their function is to block, right? So but they're all working together, they're interrelated parts with a common goal being to win, and they're all working towards that goal. So society can be seen in kind of the same way if you're looking at it through the functionalist perspective, is that we're all working together as a whole unit. Okay? Does anybody have any questions? No? All right, so the next perspective, this is called conflict theory. And conflict theory comes out of Karl Marx's teachings, right? He has the two-class idea where there's constant conflict between the upper class and the lower class, or the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And in his worldview, society is made up of groups that are all competing for scarce resources. Now, these scarce resources don't necessarily mean natural resources. It's not always like the natural environment, but it can be money, it can be affection, it could be prestige, it could be power. All of these things are scarce resources. And what Marx will say is he says that if you were to view society, you can see it may appear that there is harmony on the surface. It may appear that these groups are cooperating with one another. It may appear that they are forming alliances with one another. But if you scratch below the surface, if you dig a little deeper into society, you'll begin to see the power struggle. You'll begin to see people's inner thoughts. You'll begin to see their hidden agendas, their hidden goals, right? Because it's all about bettering oneself at the expense of the other group. Okay? And then sociologists who utilize this perspective, one of the questions, right, because these theories are meant to answer a question, they are looking at how those with power utilize it for their own good. So how do those who have gotten to positions of power, how do they utilize that power? And how is their utilization of that power, how is that bettering themselves? How are they trying to further entrench themselves within that social standing, right? Because those with power will do anything they can to retain that power. And this is the other macro theory, right? So this is the other theory where sociologists are looking at society as a whole, looking at how large groups or large institutions interact with one another. And so to help illustrate this, I think like a game show, right? Like Survivor or The Bachelor. So you probably don't watch Survivor anymore, do you? Is that like too old? It's been on for like forever. It's like 25 years or something. So that's been on. So I think, but anyway, so are you guys more familiar with The Bachelor or Bachelorette? Don't want to. Anyway, okay, so with those, I think The Bachelor. My wife watches The Bachelor all the time, like both seasons, 2 seasons every year. It's terrible, right? I think it's the stupidest show ever. I watch it, and I can feel myself getting dumber. But I think it's good to illustrate conflict theory because in these game shows, sometimes there's only one winner, right? So it's not a group, it's not like a football team where the football team wins. In these cases, there's only a single winner. But sometimes you'll see the people on these shows interact and help each other, right? They form alliances, they cooperate, they're trying to say, you know what, if you help me, I'll help you. But underneath, do they really want to help that person? Right? Because if they help that person, then what happens? They don't get the chance to win, right? It's this conflict between the contestants. Even though we might see them working together, there's always that conflict in the background underneath because only one person gets to win. There's only one final rose, right? So our last theory, our last perspective, is what's called symbolic interactionism, and this will be the only micro theory. Okay, so this is the only theory that seeks to explain individual interactions among humans, how we engage with one another, rather than looking at large institutions or large groups of people. So what symbolic interactionism believes, or what they put out there, is that individuals use symbols to develop their views of the world and communicate with one another. Now this word symbols, it's used in an extremely broad sense. So, and this one is very abstract. I think this is definitely the hardest to grasp of the three. And it is, I think, partially because of the use of the word symbols. So when we think of symbols, we often think of like writing, right, or emojis. Okay, you use an emoji, that's a symbol, and it has a meaning. But in this case, symbols are literally everything. Okay, so like titles before someone's name, like Mr., Dr., Mrs., those are symbols, right? They inform us how we engage with that person, right? The tie that I'm wearing, if you see someone wearing a tie or you see someone wearing a suit, how do you engage with that person? How do you interact with that person? Would you engage, like the little guy down here, who would you show more respect to? The guy with the briefcase and the tie, or the guy without? Because of the symbolic nature of the tie and the briefcase, right? We know what those symbols mean, and that influences how we interact with that person, right? And then symbols, again, it's not just like text, it's not just an animate object like a tie, but rather it can be more abstract, right? The names that we call people, if we, like the term boyfriend and girlfriend, those are symbols. They dictate how we engage with those individuals. They inform our decision making. And then also, one of the questions that they try to seek, these people who study or utilize this symbolic interactionism, is they want to know how behavior, or how our behavior, depends on how we define ourselves and how we define others. So part of what they're looking at is how we define our own sense of self based upon how other people interact with us, right? If you are a person who people are constantly being kind to you, they're encouraging you, you're going to have a much greater sense of self, you're going to feel better about yourself, and it's all dependent on how others engage with you. But the opposite can be true. If people are constantly putting you down, they're being mean to you, that's going to impact the way that you view yourself. It's going to give you a lower sense of self-esteem. Okay, and again, this is the only micro theory we have, so it's looking at individual interactions among humans. Okay, yes?
Is there a sociologist that's associated with this?
So there are a couple sociologists who are associated with this. They're more recent sociologists, and they weren't any of the 5 sultans that we talked about, so I didn't include them, because I wasn't super familiar with them, and B, I think that it might just like muddy it up and cloud the waters. But
George Herbert Mead?
Yes, Mead was the only one I had like kind of heard of.
M-E-A-D, is there an E on the end?
There might be an E at the end.
M-E-A-D-E. He talks about roles quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. And this is a little bit newer of a school of thought, right? So Marx and then the early guys, they were more the functionalists and the conflict theory because they were looking at society as a whole. And this takes a much more personal approach, looking at how we engage and interact. Those are good questions. Any other questions or thoughts on any of this? Anything you would like me to go back over?
Can you go to the first one again?
Yeah.
Sorry, I missed it.
No, you're good.
The very first one. Yes.
So just saying that, and just remember that these are theories, these are not like hard and fast rules, they're more just generalizations, or the evidence that we have accumulated so far points to their validity. There is nothing that disproves them, so they're still theoretical. Because everything in science is theory, right? There's no true hard, fast law in science.
You mind if I add one thing?
No,
So let's
please.
go back and look at it. You got our 5 keys, right? There's 2 keys that you could really relate to functionalism. And they're kind of a big part of, you know, which 2 of our 5 would relate here? Mr. Glick kind of hit on them a bit. Ms. Swanson? Social structure. Very good. Mr. Glick talked about that. And there's also another one. Power's a good guess? Nope. Good try. Good try. Functional integration, right? Remember we put the cycle up there, government, schools, right? Military, business, right? All of that, that's, functional integration relates to that. So think social structure, functional integration, you'll go to the next one,
Yep.
the conflict. So with conflict, which one would it be? It even says it in the slide. Power, right? So lot of stuff going on with that particular key. And then the symbolic interactionism, we're not necessarily going to use all of them. It would be what? Social action. So we talked about micro, macro with our 5 keys. Social action is more micro than it is macro. Very good stuff, Mr. Glick.
Thank you. Any questions before we finish up? No? Alright.
Let me explain to you the categories assignment. So the way it works, everybody got the handout in front of them? You have 41 terms.